I never imagined that one day I would be writing about my life on the internet. It's a strange feeling, knowing that someone you've never met and likely never will read your thoughts. I hesitated for a long time, wondering whether to share this story, but perhaps I just needed to vent. When you carry a burden for an extended period, it starts to weigh down harder. Maybe I'll start from the very beginning. I met him when I was still very young. We met by chance, as these things often happen. He was a few years older than me, seemed confident and mature, someone who knew what he wanted. His smile was the kind that makes you forget everything else. He had a way of speaking that made every word sound sincere. We started talking, and everything somehow fell into place on its own. It felt like I had met the one. With him, I felt special for the first time. He was attentive and caring, always interested in how my day went, what was bothering me, and what I was dreaming about. He was the person I could be myself around. We would talk for hours about everything under the sun. He always found a way to make me smile. Sometimes he would just show up with my favorite flowers, or invite me to dinner at the little cafe where we had our first date together. These were small things, but they made me happy. After some time, he proposed to me. It was unexpected and beautiful. I remember my heart stopping when he got down on one knee. We were having a small picnic away from the city, under the open sky. It was one of those places he often took me to let me escape the hustle and bustle. Of course, I said yes. In that moment, I was certain I had found the person I wanted to spend my entire life with. Our wedding was modest. We invited only our closest friends and family. I didn't want a big celebration. It seemed to me that the most important thing was us, not the decorations or the guest list. When we exchanged rings, I felt like I was beginning a new chapter in my life. It was truly magical. We were happy. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The first few years of marriage felt like the continuation of the fairy tale I had envisioned from the very start. We made plans, dreamed about our home, talked about traveling. He always found time for me, even when he was busy. He supported me in my endeavors and inspired me. It felt like I was living in a perfect world. But life isn't always a fairy tale. Sometimes changes happen so slowly that you don't notice them right away. At first, he became less attentive. It was minor. He might forget to ask how my day was, or not notice a new haircut. I attributed it to work, to fatigue, to the fact that relationships always reach a point where everything becomes a bit routine. At that time, I didn't see it as a problem. I often think back to those early years of our life together. They were filled with so much light, warmth, and hope. It seemed like all the bad things were happening to someone else, not to us. We were the couple people looked at and thought, now that's true love. But as I understand now, perfection doesn't exist. Perhaps I ignored the early warning signs for too long. I don't know exactly when what I now call our end began. It was like a slowly approaching shadow that enveloped our home. But back then, I still believed that everything could be fixed. When we first started living together, I was sure it would last forever. Everyone said we were the perfect match, that we complemented each other so well. I believed it too. Maybe that was true at the beginning, but life showed me that what seemed strong can start to crack at the seams. The changes didn't happen suddenly. If they had, maybe I would have noticed them sooner. But it happened gradually, like drops of water eroding a stone. At first, he became less attentive. Not that he stopped showing care altogether, but it diminished significantly. Where he once asked every evening how my day was, he now often just stayed silent. Sometimes I tried to start a conversation, but I felt like he was only half listening. Then I noticed he spent more time on his phone. He rarely used social media before, but that changed. He could sit for hours scrolling through his feed, responding to my questions briefly and irritably. I tried to justify it. Work, fatigue, age. Everyone goes through such phases, I thought, and I continued to stay silent. The next stage was the minor nitpicking. He didn't like how I cooked, even though he had always praised my dishes before. One day he said I hadn't cleaned the house properly, even though I had spent the entire day tidying up. It was a blow. I was used to him noticing my efforts, but now it felt like everything I did meant nothing. But even then, I didn't think the problem was with him. I started looking for faults in myself. Maybe I had become lazy. Maybe he was right, and I wasn't trying hard enough. With these thoughts, I began to put even more effort in. I tried to please him in everything. I cooked his favorite meals, searched for new recipes, even started keeping the house even cleaner. I thought that if I did everything perfectly, he would become the way he used to be. However, that didn't happen. The more I tried, the more he distanced himself. Sometimes I caught his cold gaze and couldn't understand what I had done wrong. This feeling of helplessness was suffocating. I stopped feeling loved. Our conversations became shorter, and the silence grew longer. I began to notice that he was avoiding me. If he used to come home on time for dinner together, he now found reasons to stay late. Sometimes he said he had a lot of work. Other times, he would just remain silent. One day, I heard him talking on the phone in another room and felt like I was becoming invisible in his life. I tried to talk to him. One day, I asked if everything was all right between us. He responded that I was making things too complicated, that I was looking for problems where there were none. I believed him. It was always easier for me to think the problem was with me than to admit that our marriage was falling apart. At some point, I stopped recognizing myself. I had always been cheerful, full of energy, with numerous interests and hobbies. But now it felt like my entire life was centered around not angering him, not disappointing him, not triggering another wave of criticism. I began tiptoeing around in my own home. This was especially evident in the evenings. I used to look forward to him coming home from work to spend time together. But now I dreaded that moment. I didn't know what mood he would be in, whether he would remain silent or start grumbling about something. I started staying late in the kitchen, finding unnecessary tasks just to avoid encountering him. One of the most painful things was that he stopped seeing me as a woman. He used to always tell me that I was beautiful, that he was lucky to have me. But now his glances and his touches became rare. I couldn't remember the last time he hugged me for no reason. The most frightening part was that I began to believe I didn't deserve more. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who had lost herself. My face, my gaze, all showed that I was exhausted, tired of trying to be good for someone who didn't care. At some point, I realized I couldn't share my feelings even with my friends. I was afraid they would judge me for allowing myself to be treated that way. Or worse, they would advise me to leave, and I wasn't ready for such a step. I was afraid of being alone, afraid to admit that my marriage wasn't what I had imagined. That's when I started spending more time with my stepsister. She often came over just to chat and have tea. Her lightness and kindness were like a breath of fresh air. She could make me smile even when I felt like I couldn't feel joy anymore. In her company, I felt different. She never criticized me, never made me feel like something was wrong with me. Her words and gestures were so sincere that I began to forget about my problems, even if only for a while. Those evenings we spent together became my salvation. I looked forward to them because I knew that for at least a few hours, I could feel alive. My stepsister entered my life as if it were destined. I think about it more and more. If it weren't for her, I probably would have completely drowned in my feelings of despair and loneliness. She came at the moment I needed someone the most to pull me out of the darkness I was sinking into. At first, it felt so natural. Her visits, her words of support. She never imposed herself, never pried into what was happening at home. But her presence alone was a salvation. I couldn't exactly pinpoint what drew me to her. Her kindness, her lightness, or how she could, without saying an extra word, make me feel that I wasn't alone. Her visits became something like a ritual for me. When she came over, I felt that for at least a few hours, I could forget about what was happening in my marriage. We drank tea, talked about little things, and I found myself thinking that in her company, I was starting to feel like myself again. These moments became the breath of fresh air I had been searching for so long. But then I noticed that I was seeking her company more and more. Her calls and messages became the highlights of my day. If she didn't reach out to me, I began to worry and find excuses to contact her myself. I found myself thinking about her even when she wasn't around. I realized something had changed for the first time when she came to me on one particularly difficult day. My husband was irritated. His words sounded like shots, and I barely held back tears. Then she appeared, as always, with a gentle smile and a small box of my favorite cookies. I looked at her and thought how lucky I was to have her. That evening, we sat in the kitchen for a long time. I didn't tell her what had happened, but I didn't need to. Her presence spoke louder than any words. When she left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching her go, and wondered why I so desperately wanted her to come back. I started to notice how my thoughts about her were becoming more and more intrusive. Sometimes I would just sit at home, reminiscing about our conversations and her laughter. I loved watching her, observing her gestures, the way she would fix her hair or laugh. I noticed everything, her favorite scent, how she dressed, even how she placed her cup on the table. These feelings scared me. She was my stepsister. Although we weren't blood relatives, I couldn't help but think about how it might appear to others. I tried to convince myself that it was merely gratitude. After all, she was the only one who supported me when I needed it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. I tried to fight myself. I told myself that it was wrong, that I needed to stop thinking about her. But the more I tried, the stronger my feelings became. One day, when she invited me over, I realized just how much I had changed. We were sitting at her place, watching a movie. She was telling me something, and I was watching her, forgetting everything happening around us. I don't remember exactly what she said, but I remember feeling a warmth in my soul just by looking at her. That's when I realized I was in love. It was a torturous, painful realization. I didn't know what to do with these feelings. I was afraid of ruining our relationship, afraid that she would find out and distance herself from me. But most of all, I was afraid of myself, of my own emotions. Every touch, every word from her now seemed to hold a special meaning. When she hugged me upon meeting, I wished that moment could last forever. When she looked at me, I felt my heart skip a beat. I began to notice how often I sought her attention. I wanted her to call me, to text me first. I caught myself getting jealous when she talked about her friends or colleagues. This feeling was so new to me that I didn't know how to handle it. One night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. I thought about how much my life had changed since she came into it. I could no longer hide the truth from myself. I loved her. When I first realized that I loved her, it was like a flash. But then fear set in. fear of what it meant for me, for our family, and for her. I tried not to think about it, not to give in to my feelings, but the more I tried to ignore them, the stronger they became. Since then, every interaction between us was filled with tension for me. I was afraid she would sense something, notice something. I tried to act as usual, but it was difficult. When she looked at me, I felt everything inside freeze. Her voice, her laughter, even her scent. All of it stirred a strange excitement within me. One day, she invited me to lunch. We were sitting in a cozy cafe, and she was talking about her week, but I couldn't concentrate on her words. I watched her smile, how her hands moved, and thought about how beautiful she was. At one point, she caught my gaze and asked if everything was all right. I hurriedly replied that I was fine, but inside, a wave of panic washed over me. I began to avoid her as much as I could. I found excuses not to meet up, but it was even harder than seeing her. I missed her presence. I waited for her calls, checked my phone every 5 minutes, hoping she would reach out. This duality was agonizing. I couldn't be near her, yet I couldn't stay away either. When she once asked why I had become less sociable, I simply said I was busy. Her voice sounded worried then, and it only heightened my guilt. Meanwhile, my relationship with my husband was deteriorating further. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was only to express his dissatisfaction. Every word he said hurt. Every remark made me feel even worse. I didn't want to come home, didn't want to see him, didn't want to hear his voice. One day, I accidentally picked up his phone. He had left it on the table, and I noticed a notification. It was a message that clearly had something personal. I wasn't planning to read it, but something inside me pushed me to. When I opened the conversation, my heart stopped. He was texting someone he was clearly close to. The messages included photos, plans to meet, words he hadn't spoken to me in a long time. I felt a lump forming in my throat. It was painful, humiliating, but at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief. His infidelity was the last straw. I couldn't live the way I had been living anymore. I decided to file for divorce. I didn't know what would happen next, but I couldn't stay with him any longer. The next day, I called her. Her voice was so warm, so familiar. I told her what had happened, and she immediately suggested we meet. We sat at her house, and she held my hand as I poured out everything. Her eyes looked at me with such compassion and understanding that I couldn't hold back. I started to cry. She embraced me, and I felt the warmth of her body, her scent. Her hair carried an intoxicating aroma. I lifted my eyes and saw her face, her lips, her eyes. My heart began to race wildly. I didn't even notice how overwhelmed I was by my emotions. My breath quickened, my skin flushed, and without realizing it, I leaned toward her. In that moment, the entire world transformed. I transformed. For the first time in years, I understood what it meant to truly love and be loved. I forgot everything, my struggles, my joys, even time itself. It all merged into a single flow of happiness and tenderness. We were one. She was there, so close, so delicate, so brave, as wild as I was. I had never experienced anything like what I felt with her. And now, as she lay beside me, smiling softly, I knew what I wanted and what I deserved. From that moment, everything changed. I couldn't see her the way I had before. It happened suddenly, yet it felt like I had been waiting for it my entire life. She became everything to me, light, warmth, something real that I hadn't even dared to dream of. The day after we crossed that line for the first time, I felt lost but happy. Her touch, her voice, even just her gaze stirred a storm of emotions within me. This wasn't just a feeling, it was a revelation. I suddenly realized that all the years I had spent in my marriage, I had never felt anything like this. The next day, I struggled to collect myself. My thoughts were in disarray. I seemed to understand everything, yet my feelings were stronger than any doubt. I remembered her smile, her words, and each time my heart ached with tenderness. I tried to continue living as I had before, but it became impossible. At home, everything felt alien, unreal. My husband was there, but his presence became unbearable. Every step he took, every word he said pushed me further away. I often thought about what had happened and tried to understand what it meant for me. My love for her became something inevitable, like breathing. I knew I couldn't turn away from it, even if it meant destroying everything I had known until then. Our meetings changed. Now there was a secret between us, binding us more strongly than anything else. When we saw each other, I tried not to let my feelings show too openly, but it was difficult. Her eyes, her smile, they reminded me how happy I was when she was near. But along with the joy came fear. Fear that it wouldn't last. That one day she might leave and I would be left alone. I understood that our relationship wasn't something we could share with the world. We came from different universes, brought together by chance. One night, lying in bed, I realized I couldn't pretend any longer. My marriage had ended long before this, but I had clung to it out of fear of the unknown. Now, I knew what I wanted. I wanted freedom. I wanted to be with the person I truly loved. The next morning, after the night I finally understood what I needed, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the reflection. There was fear in my eyes, but alongside it, there was resolve. I couldn't continue living the way I had been. The suffocating feeling was so intense, it felt like every minute in that house drained my strength. My husband was home, sitting at the table and scrolling through his phone. His indifference no longer hurt me the way it used to. It was simply another sign that our lives had drifted apart long ago. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching him, and wondered how we had reached this point. Once, I had loved him, or at least I thought I had. But now, it felt like a distant memory from someone else's life. Our relationship had crumbled into ruins, and my attempts to rebuild something from them had been in vain. I knew that if I didn't leave now, I would never be honest with myself or with her. Her face, her voice, they were constantly in my mind. She had become my purpose, my light. I knew I loved her and couldn't go on living without her. Summoning my courage, I approached my husband. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I told him we needed to talk. He looked up at me, his expression full of irritation, and it was immediately clear he wasn't ready for this conversation. But I couldn't stay silent any longer. I told him that I couldn't live like this anymore, that our relationship was over. He said nothing, but his face said it all. I braced myself for an outburst of anger, but instead, he simply stood up from the table and walked into another room. A silent acknowledgement of defeat. Packing my things turned out to be easier than I had anticipated. I felt no sadness, no regret. The only emotion that surfaced was relief. It was a strange feeling, like shedding a heavy burden I had carried for far too long. When I stepped out of the house with my bag in hand, I paused for a moment to look back. That house was no longer my home. It was the place where I had lost myself, where I had endured so much pain. But now I was free. I drove to her. The journey seemed to take longer than usual, though perhaps it was just my perception. Every mile felt like an eternity. I didn't know how she would react, but I knew I couldn't live without her any longer. When I arrived, she was home. She opened the door and instantly realized something had happened. Before I could say a word, she embraced me. It felt so natural, so right, that I could feel all my fears beginning to fade away. We sat on the couch, and I told her everything, about how long I had struggled with myself, how hard it had been to make the decision to leave. She listened without interrupting, her eyes welling up with tears. She took my hand and told me I had made the right choice, that she would always be there for me, that I wasn't alone anymore. Those words, so simple yet so profound, became my anchor. We began a new life together. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when old fears resurfaced. But every time I looked at her, I knew I had made the right decision. She was my home, my light. With her, I felt alive, felt like I could finally be myself. I was no longer afraid to look ahead because I knew she would be by my side.